evening, I'm Diane To in Hong Kong, and you're watching View TV News. Coming up on tonight's show. China says culture can't become slave of the market, while pollution is an unwelcome guest at the party congress. Police are on the hunt for a driver who's left 6 people injured after mowing down pedestrians in Yau Ma Tei. UNICEF describes squalid conditions in Bangladesh refugee camps as hell on earth for Myanmar's fleeing children. Good evening. We begin tonight with China's cultural ambitions. On day 3 of the party congress, central government officials said they want the country to become a major force in film. But they stress cultural products can't become, quote, slaves of the market. Publicity Deputy Chief Sun Zhijun told reporters ratings and box office sales can't be the only standard for the nation's cultural development. He said both functions of entertainment and education are needed, with social efficiency set as the #1 priority. Meanwhile, education reform is also a major issue for the Chinese leadership, with big changes set for university entrance exams in the next few years. For more on that, here's Sandy Huang reporting from Beijing.
Yes, today at the National Congress, education has been hitting the headlines. China's Education Ministry announced today that the college entrance exams, or Gaokao, is undergoing another reform, and that's the most widespread and challenging reform since China's modern Gaokao system was put in place in 1977. And the point of this new reform is to provide equal access to all, and that means enrolling more students from underprivileged areas into university and also allowing more migrant students to sit the Gaokao exam in the cities they study rather than having to go back to their hometowns for the exams. The new scheme is already in place in Shanghai and Zhejiang, and it will be rolled out nationwide by 2020. And over the past 5 years, 370,000 more students from these underprivileged areas were enrolled into university. And 30 provinces have already put in place systems where non-local students can sit exams locally. So we're expected to see these policies implemented even further over the next 5 years.
And that was Sandy Huang reporting from Beijing. Now, while top leaders gather there to discuss grand plans for the nation's future, one thing that's certainly proving to be a hurdle: pollution. Anissa Lee has that story.
A blanket of smog is covering Beijing. Just business as usual, especially as coal boilers fire up ahead of winter. Except this wasn't supposed to happen. The country's top communist leaders are gathered in Beijing for a major congress that only happens every 5 years. The party has waged a massive blue sky campaign in order to create the perfect public display, but clearly something's gone wrong. I'm Anissa Lee in Beijing. Officials met back in September to figure out how to clean up the skies ahead of the Congress. They drew up a plan to cut pollution from factories and cars. Some local restaurants even told Reuters that they were ordered to shut down their barbecues. But even after all those measures, the pollution reading this morning from the American Embassy's air monitor was over 170, officially in the unhealthy range. That's different from China's own reading, which was only around 120 on Friday morning, although many question Beijing's official data. But there's no question that top leaders are serious about tackling toxic air. Earlier this year, they hired thousands of experts to track and enforce strict new regulations. That commitment was on display at the opening of the Congress, as President Xi Jinping talked about a clean energy revolution and promised not to back down in the war on pollution. But in the world's second largest economy, where coal is still king, cleaning up the air is no walk in the park, especially when the weather is not cooperating. Experts say low winds and high humidity have trapped pollution in the capital, cheating the Communist Party out of its picture postcard political meeting and exposing the limits of its power.
Now to local news. Police are hunting a man who mowed down passers-by and rammed into 2 vehicles in Yau Ma Tei this morning. The crash left at least 6 people injured. Footage provided by members of the public shows the driver in a face mask abandoning his car outside the wholesale fruit market and fleeing the scene. At around 11 o'clock, the suspect first knocked down 3 pedestrians at the junction of Nathan Road and Mamming Lane. The car then ploughed into 3 other people and slammed into a minibus and a double-decker. The driver is said to be around 1.8 meters tall and in his 30s. He's also not the owner of the car, which didn't have a license plate and had a penalty ticket stuck to it. To other local news, standardizing working hours isn't a priority right now. That's according to Hong Kong's Labour chief, who says the government is focusing on scrapping the MPF offsetting mechanism and extending both maternity and paternity leave. Lord Chi Kwong said the government must keep in mind SMEs' interests when changing labour policies. But he did say the administration is committed to offering more support to strengthen labour protection while reducing any burden on SMEs. He also ruled out making public holidays equivalent in status to statutory holidays, which would give local workers more time off.
Its impact is greater than the impact of extending both maternity and paternity leave. 98% of local employers are SMEs owners. They need time to adapt to every change in policies. What we can do and what they can adapt during this 5-year term is very limited, and they need to get used to the cancellation of the MPF offsetting mechanism.
Meantime, about 80 non-franchise bus drivers staged a protest outside LegCo, calling on the government to include red minibuses and shuttle buses in a new travel subsidy scheme. Under the plan, commuters spending more than $400 a month can get up to $300 in subsidies. Transport Minister Frank Chan promised to look into coverage of the scheme carefully and said he's aiming to kick it off in 3 months. Elsewhere now, to the latest on the Rohingya refugee crisis. The United Nations Children's Fund is bringing the focus on the desperate situation for the hundreds of thousands of young ones trapped in Bangladeshi camps. Here's Graham Mackay with the details.
Nearly 340,000 Rohingya Muslim children are living in squalid camps without enough food or water. That number coming from the United Nations International Children's Fund on Friday in a report on refugees from Myanmar who have fled to neighbouring Bangladesh.
Outcast and desperate, that was the phrase that we came up with. To me, it doesn't really begin to approach, to capture the severity of what we believe to be the situation on the ground, the reality on the ground for something like now approaching 600,000 people, of whom well over half are children.
UNICEF says many of the children are traumatised by brutal acts they've witnessed at the hands of Myanmar soldiers. Hundreds of thousands of Rohingya have been forced to abandon their villages after the army launched a crackdown on the Muslim minority described by the UN as ethnic cleansing. Friday's report says up to 12,000 children are arriving in Bangladesh every week, forced to settle in dirty shelters with a high risk of waterborne diseases like diarrhea, measles, even cholera. The UN is demanding that atrocities against children and civilians in Myanmar must stop, but it admits this is a crisis that won't be ending anytime soon.
All right, up next, the latest from the world of business. We'll start with a look at what's been happening here in the markets in Hong Kong. The Hang Seng Index of leading shares finished the day up 1.17%, rebounding after yesterday's poor performance, with investors picking up bargains. Consumer stocks and offshore listed mainland shares led markets higher, ending the week on a positive note. Well, Hong Kong has been urged to investigate claims that banks in the city have been used to launder money allegedly linked to corruption in South Africa. The FBI and the UK's Financial Conduct Authority are looking into links between South Africa's Gupta family and the corruption scandal involving their friendship with the country's president, Jacob Zuma. A British lawmaker says money from corrupt deals were allegedly funneled through banks in Dubai and Hong Kong. The Guptas and Zuma have denied any wrongdoing.
We may not be aware of the exact issues that relate to companies that are working in South Africa who are operating in other countries, but we would welcome any information that might help to share such a light in terms of what is happening in our country if it arose from other countries.
Well, Apple's iPhone has raised big questions in the minds of investors and consumers. Shares in the company fell nearly 3% overnight on signs of poor demand for the iPhone 8. Here's Fred Karayama.
The signs of poor demand for the iPhone 8 sent Apple stock lower on Thursday. Canada's largest mobile network, Rogers Communications, said appetite for the product has been anemic. Verizon also admitted that the number of upgrades in the third quarter was lower than in previous years. And a newspaper in Taiwan reported Apple has cut production orders on iPhone 8 by more than 50% for the rest of the year. A number of sector analysts played down the concerns. Michael Bappas of Bappas Group at Hightower.
I know there was a glitch with the software updates and that most likely they'll figure it out. You could see a small pullback just in the markets in general, and that could cause Apple to pull back. But I just think today I couldn't find anything that would give us any reason to panic yet.
Apple released the iPhone 8 and iPhone 8 Plus in September. Its new iPhone 10 is coming out in early November.
Different problems, meanwhile, at Nissan, which is currently being investigated by the Japanese government for using inappropriate inspection practices for at least 20 years. That's according to Japanese broadcaster NHK, in allegations that go far beyond the car company's initial acknowledgement. The practices have been happening for 3 years. The auto manufacturing giant is accused of using unqualified inspectors to make final checks on vehicles, which led to a recall of all 1.2 million cars it sold in Japan in the last 3 years. To look at how factories in the future could be doing things, researchers at MIT in the US have begun applying virtual reality to manufacturing lines in a move that could herald another technological revolution in how we make things. Ben Gruber has more.
For white-collared workers, the internet has transformed how people go about their business. But for blue-collared workers, the same can't be said. Even as robots continue to enter factories, human workers are still critical to many production processes. But now researchers are developing a new system which allows workers to remotely control robots using a virtual reality space. When a user puts on a VR headset, they enter the robot's head, seeing what the robot sees and controlling its arms and hands with controllers in a virtual